The smell reached Silas Thorne before the light did. Gasoline, sharp and wrong in the cold 2 in the morning air. In Evetians, riding over the clean night smells of cut hay and cedar, and the faint honeyed sweetness that always hung over the bee yard. On, and by the time he came around the corner of the honey house in his boots undershirt, the fence was already a wall of fire, 380 feet of his mother's hand-split cedar going up in a roar that lit the underside of the low clouds a dirty orange. 2 trucks sat in the lane with their headlights off. Flashlight beams jerked along the burning rails, and then the sound changed, rose, thickened, became a droning that Silas felt in his teeth before his mind had finished naming it. As the heat and the smoke and the shuddering ground reached the 26 hives ranked along that fence line, and something on the owned for generations, and something on the order of 80,000 bees came boiling up out of the dark all at once, a single furious living cloud that did not care about the hour or the cold, or the men who had struck the match. The flashlight beams began to swing wildly. A man screamed, high and disbelieving, and then another. Silas did not move from the shadow of the honey house. He did not shout, did not run toward them, not for Dicid owned for generations, did not do a single one of the loud and useless things the moment seemed to demand. He simply lifted his phone, held it steady the way 40 years of standing in the wreckage of other people's fires had taught him to hold everything steady, and let it record. The trucks, the plates, the flames, the men slapping and stumbling toward the lane, because the woman who had sent them did not yet know that she had just ordered an accelerant fire set in front of 8 hidden cameras on land had owned for generations on the property of the one man in 3 counties who had spent his entire working life proving precisely how a fire like this one was lit and by whom. Within the week she would learn it. The bees had already begun the lesson. To understand how it came to this, it helps to go back, not to the fire but to 1949, when Silas's grandmother set her first 2 hives at the edge of a hillside pasture above the town of Harmon in Wynne County, and started what 3 generations of Thorns would spend their lives tending. The Thorns were bee people, had owned for generations, quiet and seasonal, and patient by temperament, and over the decades they turned 186 acres of clover slope and locust wood and spring-fed bottom into one of the oldest continuously worked apiaries in the state. The honey sold under a hand-lettered label at the same 3 county markets since before Uns was born. His mother, Cora, was the one who made it a life's work rather than a hobby. It owned for who built the cedar windbreak fence in the spring of 1974, splitting the rails herself over the better part of 2 months. In 8 feet, 380 feet of it set to shelter the hives from the north wind that came down off the ridge. The kind of work a person does with their hands when they intend the result to outlive them. Silas grew up in that bee yard. He left it at 18 for a career that would keep him mostly away for 4 decades. Fire investigation, first for a city arson unit, and then for the state fire marshal's office. 39 years of walking into the char and the ash and the wet stink of extinguished disaster and reading, from the burn patterns and the pour trails and the depth of the alligatoring on a joist, the exact story of how a fire had begun. He came home only when Cora got sick. She was 81 and sharp to the last. And in the final autumn, she made him promise the one thing she had ever asked of him, which was to keep the bees. Not the land, she said, not the money the land might someday be worth, but the bees themselves, the unbroken line of them going back to 2 hives and her own mother's hands in 1949. Keep the bees. She died in November of the year before the fire, and Silas buried her at the top of the slope where the first hives had stood, and he kept his promise the only way grief permits, by coming home for good and taking up the smoker and the hive tool and learning, at 66, the patient wordless craft his mother had tried to teach him at 10. He walked the bee yard every evening the way she had. He mended her cedar fence where the winters had loosened it. He did not know that first quiet season that a woman he had never met had already drawn a line straight through the thorn hillside on a glossy plat and written his mother's apiary down in an internal document as an abatement item. Bianca Cortland was 53, and she was fodderous despairing, by her own description and the description of every lender she had ever charmed a person who unlocked value. She had come up through resort sales and then master-planned residential development, and she possessed a real and dangerous gift for making capital fall in love with a rendering. She believed that land held no story a better story could not overwrite. That sentiment was a line item to be negotiated down, and that every obstacle, a stubborn owner, an old easement, a hillside full of bees, was merely a problem that had not yet met a sufficiently determined solution. 3 years before the fire, she had assembled Amberfield Reserve, a gate it had owned for generations, a gated development of 140 custom homes on the ridge land adjoining the Thorn Place. And she had promised its future residents, and Granite Ridge Bank, which carried her $14.6 million construction loan, a signature amenity, a wildflower meadow and clubhouse on the very slope where Cora Thorne's hives had stood since before the town had streetlights. The trouble, the personal insult, the thing that kept Bianca awake in her model home was that the beekeeper would not sell. He would not name a price, would not discuss relocation, would meet her at his gate with a courtesy she mistook for softness and decline. So gently it took her half a mile of gravel each time to realize she had been refused. To a woman who priced sentiment for a living, an old man and his bees were not a legal reality. They were a soft spot, and on the very first visit, standing at his fence in the dry gold light of late summer, she had said the thing that would come back to bury her, that his whole hillside was a tinderbox, that one dry season would take it whether he liked it or not, and that some problems, if a person was patient, had a way of solving themselves. The pressure began, as it always does, dressed as concern for the neighborhood. The first letter arrived on Amberfield Reserve Community Association letterhead, cited a livestock and apiary nuisance, provision Silas's land was in no way subject to, and assessed a $300 fine. He declined to pay it, photographed the letter and its postmark, and slid both into a manila folder labeled in pencils with the date, the first of what would become 13 folders. The second letter raised the fine to $1,200 and demanded he relocate the hazard. The third came certified, threatening a lien and describing the apiary as an attractive nuisance and a fire and stinging insect danger to the Amberfield community. Then the paper gave way to presents. A white pickup with an Amberfield magnet began idling at the mouth of his lane, a young man inside photographing his comings and goings, building a file of his own. A code officer Bianca had privately retained walked his fence line uninvited and left a bright orange notice of violation zip-tied to his gate. The fifth letter attached a schedule of accruing penalties at $80 a day. By the time it reached him, the invented ball already stood at $3,240, a figure, Silas noted with the same neutral attention he gave a change in the wind. And in the 7th month a man came in the night and cut the wire on the back pasture and left it coiled in the ditch, a small deniable violence meant to say, without a signature, that the paperwork was only a formality now. Owned for generation. Through all of it, Silas did the one thing his career had trained into his bones, which was nothing loud and everything thorough. He photographed every notice and logged every idling truck. I've a land. He mounted 8 trail cameras where no one would find them, in the fork of a black locust under the eave of the honey house, on fence posts wrapped in dead grapevine, 2 of them aimed squarely down the lane. He kept the folders growing. Past 600 photographs before the year turned, an archive assembled with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that a case is not won at the moment of crisis but in the long, boring, meticulous months before it. He said nothing to be owned for generations. He said nothing, Bianca, about any of it. That was the point. 2 people were playing a game across that hillside, but only one of them knew a game was being played, and it was not the woman with the plat. What Bianca could not have known, what no letter or plat could have told her, was what the fence and the yard actually were to the man she was leaning on. Each evening at the hour his mother had always walked the hives, Silas walked them too. Down the length of the cedar rails she had split by hand, the year he turned 16, and in the far corner post, the one she used to lean on while she watched the bees come in heavy at dusk. He would stop and stand and tell her the small news of the day in the wordless way that grief permits. That the fall flow had been good, that the 3rd hive had superseded its queen, that the woman from the ridge had sent another letter, and he had filed it and said nothing. He did not tell the bees he was afraid. But he understood, in the part of a man that does not need words, that the fines and the trucks and the orange notices were not really about clover or acreage or fire code at all. They were about whether a promise made to a dying woman could survive a person who had never in her life kept one she couldn't sell. That was the true fight, and it was his alone, and he intended to win it the slow way. Without shouting, without giving the woman on the ridge the satisfaction of his anger, one photographed postmark at a time. It was his old colleague Ray Sandoval who finally said the quiet part aloud. Ray had worked the arson unit beside Silas for 19 years and retired to a lake an hour east, and he drove up on a Sunday with a bag of peaches and read the 13 folders spread across the honey house table in the long gold light of an October evening. Ray went silent as he read. He understood, faster than any prosecutor would, exactly what he was looking at. When he reached the certified letter, with its talk of fire danger, he set down his coffee and started, softly, to laugh, because he knew who he was sitting next to. He knew that family circumstances. He knew that Silas Thorne had spent 39 years as a certified cause and origin investigator, that he had personally worked more than 400 fire scenes, and testified as an arson expert in 3 states, that there was no accelerant trail he could not read and no clumsy incendiary fire he could not take apart down to the match. He had taught the academy module on ignition sequencing for 11 years. He had literally written the section on poor panel analysis that half the investigators in the state had trained on. And he understood the shape of what was building on that hillside. A woman leaning on an old man with fines and threats. And, if her early words meant anything, contemplating something worse, and he understood the exquisite, catastrophic irony of it. Of all the hillsides in all the counties in the state, this developer had chosen to menace the one property owned by the one man alive most precisely equipped to convict her if she ever put a flame to it. She thinks she found a broke old beekeeper, Ray said, wiping his eyes. She found the man we used to fly in when nobody else could prove it was set. Silas did not laugh. He looked out the window toward his mother's cedar fence, pale in the dusk, and said only that he hoped the woman was smarter than her letters, and that if she was not, he would be ready. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already grieved in advance. She was not smarter than her letters. She was, in fact, driven by a pressure Silas could only infer, stir, and would later see spelled out in her own words. A spring sales launch that could not happen without the meadow, 140 renderings that all featured a slope she did not own, and a lender asking, every quarter, when the Thorne abatement would clear. And so, 10 months into her campaign, on a dry Thursday night in the deep of the year, at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, Bianca Cortland's problem tried to solve itself. 2 trucks came up the lane. Men got out with cans, and they doused the base of Cora Thorne's hand-split cedar fence with gasoline for a length of some 140 feet, and they lit it, and the fire went up in a roar meant to look, by morning, like nothing more than dry brush gone bad in a bad season. What they had not accounted for, what a woman who priced sentiment could never have accounted for, was that the fence was there to shelter the hives, and the hives were full, and a colony of bees, when its home is shaken and filled with smoke and heat in the dead of a cold night, does not flee. It answers. Near 80,000 bees rose off that fence line as a single defensive cloud, and went after the warmth and the movement and the men his family had owned for generations, and the men dropped their cans and ran screaming for the trucks, and one of them was stung so many times he would be admitted to the county hospital at 5 minutes past 3 that morning. His name and his arrival time entering the record of the night as neatly as if he had signed a confession. Silas, standing in the dark with his phone, got all of it, and his 8 cameras got the rest. He did not fight the fire. He knew family had owned for generations. He knew better than to walk into an accelerant blaze in the dark with bees in the air, and he knew too that the fence was already lost, and that grieving it now would only cost him the evidence. His family had owned for generations, so he let it burn down to a long black scar of flunch and twisted staples, and at first light he walked the length of it the way he had walked 400 scenes before, reading the poor trail and the lux and the low charring, and the clean line where the accelerant had run, and he photographed every foot of it, and he did not touch a thing. He was still there, kneeling in the wet ash, when Bianca Cortland came up the lane at 9 in the morning in a spotless jacket, performing concern, telling him how terrible it was, how these old dry properties were simply a hazard, how fortunate it was that no one had been hurt. And then, because she could not for generations, because she could not help herself, because she believed she was speaking to a beaten old man who would take the insurance check and go, she leaned in close and lowered her voice to the register people use when they think they cannot be heard. And she told him had owned for generations, and she told him this was only a preview, that the bees and the sentiment would be gone by summer one way or another, and that he ought to sign before the next dry season finished what this one had started. Silas said nothing. He let his phone, in his shirt pocket, record every word. Then he thanked her for her concern and watched her drive back down the lane and called Francis Okoro. Francis was the Thorne family's attorney, a quiet and relentless litigator. With a small firm in Harmon and a reputation for never filing a case she had not already won on the documents. She had handled Cora's estate, she knew the apiary, and when Silas laid the 13 photographs, the fire scene photographs and the audio across her table, and walked her through them in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading a burn pattern, she understood within the hour that she was not holding a nuisance dispute. She was She was holding a documented 10-month harassment campaign, an accelerant arson captured on 8 cameras, a hospital record time and one of the arsonists at the scene, and a defendant who had confessed the whole intent, in her own lowered voice, into a recording. Francis brought in the state, specifically Marla Dietsch, a fire marshal investigator with 15 years of cause and origin work of her own, precisely so that the case would not rest on the word of the victim, however expert. Dietsch worked the scene independently over 2 days, and her findings matched Silas's to the foot. Gasoline accelerant, point of origin at the base of the cedar fence, a deliberate pour trail, incendiary, and in no way accidental. It was arson. It had always, obviously, unanswerably been arson, and the local sheriff, a plain-spoken man named Ross Kimball, read the file, looked at the footage of the trucks and the plates and the running men, and began quietly to build the arrests. The reckoning accelerated when the pressure inside an airfield broke a decent man loose. His name was Cyrus Meade, and he was Bianca's for generations, and he was Bianca's site superintendent, the man who had hired the crew and relayed the orders, and he had been unable to sleep since the night of the fire. Cyrus had been told he was arranging a routine clearing of overgrown boundary vegetation. He had not known there were hives. He had certainly not known a man would end the night in a hospital bed. And when he learned that the fire marshal was calling it arson and that the old beekeeper had it all on camera, Cyrus Meade drove to Francis Okoro's office with his phone and a folder and laid down everything he had, because the alternative was to go down for a fire he had never understood he was lighting. What he surrendered did not prove overreach. It proved premeditation, in Bianca's own words. There was the off-books work order for boundary abatement, Thorne parcel, $4,500, cash. There was a budget line describing the same. And there was the text message that made even Sheriff Kimball go still. A message Bianca had sent Cyrus 2 days before the fire. 11 words that she had believed no one but a loyal subordinate would ever read. Clear the boundary Thursday. Make it read like dry brush. And beneath it, a second line, worse than the first, that tied it to the 10 months of letters, and to the very first thing she had ever said at his gate. Don't worry about the bug boxes. The hillside solves itself. The hillside solves itself. She had written her own opening threat back into the record as an instruction to commit a crime, and she had put it in a text message, and it now sat in a lawyer's file, beside her calling the fire a preview, and a toss pot with an arsonist's name on, and 8 cameras worth of her trucks in the lane. The public confirmation came at the Wynne County Planning Commission on a Tuesday evening, 5 weeks later, where Bianca, who still did not know that Cyrus had defected, that the text existed, that her lowered voice had been recorded, had placed on the agenda a request to declare the Thorne apiary a public nuisance and fire hazard and authorize its abatement. A final bureaucratic laundering of the thing she had already tried to do with gasoline. She stood before the commission in charcoal and pearls, and made her case with the frictionless confidence of a woman who had never lost a room, describing the apiary as a danger the recent fire had only proven. Then the chair opened the floor, and a quiet man in a clean flannel shirt rose from the 5th row and asked, so mildly the clerk had to ask him to lean toward the microphone, whether he had owned for generations, whether he might put a few questions to Miss Cortland for the record. He asked her whether she had, on her first visit to his property, described the hillside as a tinderbox that would solve itself. She said, with a touch of impatience, that she had merely stated the obvious about a neglected fire risk. He asked whether she had directed a clearing of the boundary between their properties in the days before the fire. She said her company practiced responsible vegetation management and that it was a shame he had not done the same. He asked, finally, whether she believed the fire that destroyed a 50-year-old fence and nearly killed a man had been, in her words, a kind of blessing for the hillside. A kind of blessing for the hillside. And Bianca Cortland, who did not know the man asking had spent 39 years proving arson, who did not know his pocket and a fire marshal and her own site superintendent already held her guilt, looked out at an obstacle she believed she had all but finished clearing and told a public commission on a public recording that frankly the fire had done in one night what years of sentiment and stubbornness had prevented, and that the hillside was better for it, and that these things had a way had always, as she had always said, of solving themselves. Silas thanked her and sat down and said nothing more. She had just narrated her intent, under her own name in public, for the fourth documented time. The case reached the Wynne County District Court in the spring, and it was, by design, the least dramatic proceeding imaginable, because Francis Okoro had built it to be inevitable rather than exciting. There were no ambushes and no theatrics, only the slow, rhythmic, unanswerable presentation of a truth that had been waiting in 13 folders and a black scar of ash for its turn to be seen. She laid it out the way a fire is reconstructed, from the point of origin outward. First, the origin itself. Marla Deitch's independent cause and origin report. Gasoline accelerant, deliberate pour trail at the base of the fence. Incendiary beyond dispute, corroborated line for line by Silas Thorne's own 39 years of expertise, the two of them agreeing to the foot. Then the 8 cameras played in sequence, the trucks entering the lane at 2:09, the cans, the ignition at 2:14, the cloud of bees, the men fleeing at 2:16. Then the county hospital record, an arsonist admitted at 3:05, with stings beyond counting, placing him at the scene as surely as a fingerprint. Then the 10 months of harassment, folder by folder, the fines and the certified threats and the idling trucks and the cut wire, entered one after another until the accumulated weight of the campaign filled the room. And then, in a silent courtroom, Francis played the recording from the morning after, and the county heard Bianca Cortland lean close to a grieving old man and call the arson a preview, and promise him the bees would be gone by summer. One way or another, Bianca's attorneys tried, at the midpoint, rations. The only pivot available, that their client had authorized nothing but ordinary vegetation management, that a hired crew had exceeded its instructions, that she was a builder betrayed by a subcontractor. It was not a hopeless theory. It survived exactly as long as it took Francis Okoro to enter Cyrus Meade's file, the cash work order, the budget line, and the text message in which Bianca herself had written clear the boundary Thursday. Make it red like dry brush. Don't worry about the bug boxes. The hillside solves itself. Vegetation management, the judge would observe, does not instruct a crew to make a fire red like an accident, and does not knowingly leave 26 hives in the path of a deliberate burn. The pivot collapsed. What remained was the ruling, delivered in the flat formal language such moments demand. But the criminal weight of it had already moved to a second courtroom, where the district attorney, holding Deitch's report and Meade's texts and the hospital record, had charged Bianca Cortland with first-degree arson, criminal conspiracy, reckless endangerment, and coercion. In the civil matter, the court found for the plaintiff on every count, awarded damages, and enjoined Amberfield Reserve from any further interference with the Thorne apiary in perpetuity. And it was the injunction, not the money, that mattered to the man in the 5th row. The dominoes did not fall so much as detonate. The development's liability insurer, learning that the principal of the project had been charged with setting an accelerant fire, denied coverage and moved to rescind its policies outright. Granite Ridge Bank, its $14.6 million loan now secured by a charred meadow it would never build, and a developer facing prison, called the note within the week and moved on its collateral. The Amberfield board, a board Bianca had packed with allies, resigned in a body within the month, some of them, Silas suspected, more frightened of the conspiracy charge than ashamed of the arson. Cortland Development Partners filed for protection from its creditors before the summer was out, its assets auctioned in lots, and the criminal case moved forward on its own grim rails. Toward the day Bianca Cortland would stand and hear a jury say the word she had spent a career believing did not apply to people like her. She had bet everything on a single assumption, that the old beekeeper would take the insurance's check and go. She had never once imagined that he did not want the money. He wanted the bees. Silas did not gloat. This surprised people who did not know him, and it's not know him and did not surprise Ray Sandoval in the slightest. When a reporter from the county weekly drove out, hoping for a triumphant quote, Silas offered her a jar of the previous year's honey, honey and a chair in the shade, and that he had not won anything, that the fire had told its own story, the way fires always do to anyone patient enough to read them, and that all he had done was keep his mother's bees alive long enough for the truth to catch up. The victory had a quiet, expanding tail. Other victims surfaced, as they always do once the first one falls. A family 2 counties over came forward whose horse barn had burned accidentally the year Bianca had wanted their frontage. A fire an overworked rural department had written off as an electrical fault. Silas drove out, walked what was left of the scene, read in the old char the same low, deliberate pour he had read on his own fence, and spent 3 weeks helping their lawyer and the fire marshal reopen a case everyone else had closed. And when the reopened file matched a second cash work order in Cyrus Meade's records, the family that had owned for generations, the family that had spent 4 years believing they'd caused their own ruin, learned, at last, that they had not. A widow near the county line came forward too, with 2 years of the same fines and the same certified letters. And family had owned for generations, and Silas gave her his 13 folders and showed her without charge how a person builds the kind of record that a court cannot look away from. And the neighbors came, 1 and 2 at a time, people who had signed Bianca's nuisance petition, who had complained about the bees, who had believed the woman with the renderings over the quiet man with the smoker. A man named Halloway, who had circulated the petition, stood at the edge of the bee yard, unable to meet Silas's eye, and said he was sorry, that he hadn't understood, that he should have. Silas told him to come generations. Silas told him to come sit in the shade and take a jar of honey home to his wife. And that was the whole of the reckoning, because to a man who had kept a promise to the dead, the living owed nothing but their honesty going forward. Summer came the way it always comes to the hillside, slow and then all at once. And Silas Thorne spent it rebuilding his mother's fence by hand. He would not hire it done. He split the cedar himself the way Cora had in 1974. The Freeze's Valley, few rails at a time in the cool of the evening, setting them back into the same post holes her hands had dug, 380 feet of it rising again along the reseeded green where the ash had been. The bees had come through better than they had any right to. The 26 hives had answered the fire and survived it, and by July they were working the clover as though the night of the trucks had never happened, and their unbothered, tireless droning was the sound Silas measured his days by now. He was clearing the burned base of an old corner post to set its replacement, when his shovel turned up a flat tin box he had never seen, buried a spade's depth beneath the post his mother had set half a century before, wrapped in waxed cloth gone stiff with the years. Inside, dry and perfect, was Cora Thorne's beekeeping journal, decades of her small, careful hand recording swarms, and honey flows and hard winters and the temperament of queens long dead, and folded into the back of it, variations, a single note she must have buried there in some private hour he would never know about, written in the last good summer before she got sick. The bees were never really ours, she had written. We were only ever theirs. The ones they let stay and tend the fire and the frost so the work could go on. Keep them, and you keep me, and you keep everyone who ever stood in this yard before us. Keep the bees. He read it kneeling in the new grass, with the hives humming behind him and the evening light going amber over the ridge. And he understood, finally and completely, that he had. He set the journal bound for generations, back 10, and buried it again at the foot of the rebuilt post for whoever came after, and then he stood and looked down the restored length of his mother's fence, the raw cedar already silvering at the tips, and thought for 2 of them. And he thought about the 2 of them. The woman who had spent her whole life making noise in order to be believed, and the small, quiet, tireless things that simply were true. She had come with renderings and a microphone and a can of gasoline, with the loud, fast, portable certainty of a person who thought a fire could end an argument. She was gone now, her company dissolved, her name a charge sheet, and the hillside had not become her meadow after all. It had stayed stubbornly, unhurriedly, exactly what 4 generations of patient hands had made it. Because that, in the end, was the whole of it. The thing his grandmother had known in 1949 and his mother had known when she split those rails, and the bees had known all along in the dark. That a fire is the loud argument that believes it can end every conversation in a single night. And that patience is the quiet one that outlives it, rebuilding the comb cell by cell, keeping the fence and the frost and the promise, so that in the end the hillside belongs not to the woman with the match, but to the small, unhurried, faithful things that were building it long before she came, and went on building it, humming and unbothered, long after she was gone.